first time I heard him, I thought it was the wind moving through the burned trees. A thin, broken sound drifted across the blackened pines, like a whistle that kept cracking in the middle. The forest was still steaming from yesterday's fire, and ash clung to the moss like gray snow. Every step released the sharp smell of burned resin, and the silence felt unnaturally heavy, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. Then the sound came again, clearer this time, trembling with fear. I followed it carefully down a small slope and around a fallen trunk that had burned hollow from the inside. Behind it, something moved. 2 tiny eyes flashed in the shadow. He was a bear cub, and he was far too small to be alone. His fur was dusty and slightly singed at the tips, as if he had run through smoke and barely escaped. He pressed himself into the dark space beneath the log, shaking so hard I could see the tremor ripple through his thin shoulders. I raised my hands slowly, trying to make myself look as harmless as possible. I spoke in a calm voice, knowing he could not understand my words but hoping he might sense my tone. The moment I leaned forward, he reacted with pure panic. He burst out from under the log and bolted into the brush, stumbling over a scorched branch and rolling before scrambling back up. He vanished into the burned undergrowth, wheezing and desperate to escape the human shape standing in front of him. I remained there long after he disappeared, feeling a helplessness that settled deep in my chest. If he kept running like that, he would break a leg or wander into open ground where predators or even roads could end his short life. The fire had stripped this forest of food, shelter, and safety. There were no berries left, no insects crawling under bark, and no thick cover to hide in. That night, I went home with ash in my hair and the image of his frightened eyes replaying over and over in my mind. A bear cub cannot survive alone for long, and I knew time was already working against him. Sleep never came. I kept thinking about how he had reacted to me. It was not aggression or anger. It was terror. I remembered something an old wildlife rehabilitator once told me. Sometimes the best way to help is to stop looking like the threat. That sentence echoed in my head until it led me to my garage. Hanging on the wall was an old bear costume from a community event years ago. It was bulky, heavy, and far from realistic, but it altered the human outline enough to change perception. The idea felt ridiculous at first, and I stood there staring at the suit until embarrassment slowly turned into resolve. If the cub feared the silhouette of a man, perhaps removing that silhouette would buy me a chance. The next morning, I packed a backpack with water, gloves, a first aid kit, a blanket, and soft food suitable for a young cub. I also brought a small carrier that could be closed gently without chasing him. Then I stepped into the costume. It was hot and uncomfortable, and the headpiece narrowed my vision to a tunnel. I looked absurd, but the situation demanded creativity rather than pride. When I returned to the burned forest, I found him near the same hollow log. He looked weaker than the day before. His cries were softer, and his movements lacked strength. I approached slowly, forcing myself into a clumsy, heavy gait that would not resemble a human stride. I sat at a distance and placed the food on the ground before lowering my head and remaining still. He watched me intensely. At first he huffed and retreated a few steps, unsure of what stood before him. I did not move. Minutes passed before hunger overcame fear. He edged forward, one hesitant step at a time, sniffing the air with quick, nervous breaths. When he finally reached the food, he grabbed it and darted back toward the hollow. But he did not flee the area entirely. That small decision marked the first crack in the wall of fear between us. Over the next several days, I repeated the same routine. I arrived in the costume, placed food down, and waited without sudden movements. The forest slowly shifted from scorched stillness to damp recovery as rain turned ash into gray paste and softened the smell of smoke. The cub, whom I began calling Buddy in my thoughts just to steady myself, also began to change. On the 3rd day, he stayed in sight while eating. On the 4th day, he remained only a few feet away. On the 5th day, he made a quiet sound that no longer resembled a cry but something closer to curiosity. The true conflict was not convincing him to eat. It was balancing trust with urgency. He was surviving, yet he was too thin and far too young to remain in a damaged habitat alone. I needed to bring him to a rehabilitation center, but any attempt to grab him too soon would shatter the fragile bond we had built. I began placing the food near the carrier. On the first day, it sat beside it. On the second day, it rested at the entrance. On the third day, it was just inside the door. Each time Buddy hesitated, visibly torn between hunger and caution. Each time he chose to move forward, even if only by a few inches. One evening, the wind carried a distant, unmistakable call of an adult bear. Buddy froze instantly, his ears standing tall as his body stiffened. He scanned the darkened slope as if expecting danger to emerge at any second. Instead of retreating from me, he stepped closer and pressed lightly against my leg. The gesture was small, but it carried enormous meaning. In that moment, he chose proximity over isolation. He chose the shape that no longer terrified him. The following day, I placed the food deep inside the carrier and sat back as I always did. Buddy approached, sniffed, and looked at me as if weighing an invisible question. I lowered my head and remained motionless. After a long pause, he stepped inside completely and began eating. My hands trembled inside the padded paws of the costume as I slowly reached forward and closed the door with careful control. He startled but did not thrash wildly. He breathed hard and watched me, confused yet not consumed by panic. I carried him to the truck while still wearing the costume, aware of how strange the sight must have looked. At the rehabilitation center, I explained everything quickly to the staff. The fire, the fear, the days of patience, and the unconventional method that allowed me to get close without causing trauma. One of the rehabilitators listened thoughtfully and nodded, recognizing that the altered silhouette had reduced the cub's instinctive fear response. They transferred Buddy into a clean enclosure with straw bedding and fresh water. He looked around uncertainly but did not react with the frantic desperation I had seen on the first day. When the staff stepped back, he glanced toward me, still in the costume, as though confirming a familiar presence. I crouched outside the enclosure and lowered my head once more, maintaining the silent language that had carried us this far. Eventually, I walked to the parking lot and removed the bare head. Cool air hit my face, and I felt both relief and an unexpected ache. Part of me wanted to stay and continue being the safe figure he leaned toward, yet I understood that real rescue means stepping away. Buddy needed to grow into a wild bear, not into an animal dependent on a disguised human. A week later, the center called with an update. Buddy was eating well, gaining weight, and beginning to interact with other cubs. He no longer needed the costume or the illusion of familiarity. He was adjusting to a life that would eventually return him to the forest. When people ask whether wearing the suit felt foolish, I tell them that pride has little value in a burned forest with an orphaned cub. What matters is patience and the willingness to adapt. Helping sometimes requires setting aside dignity, convenience, and even identity for the sake of another living creature. In that scorched landscape, becoming less visibly human created a bridge strong enough for a frightened cub to cross. Once he reached safety, that bridge could disappear, leaving him with what he truly needed: a second chance at being wild.
Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories. And now just click the playlist or the next video on your screen.